Greetings, good colleagues of our national system of innovation and comrades in seeking to progressively and creatively destroy the constraints on our and our continent's future endogenous development. I'm grateful to the National Science and Technology Forum and its partners in organizing this Indigenous Knowledge-Based Technology Innovation Investment Summit for affording me the opportunity to share some thoughts on the question of why invest in IK-based technology innovation sector. I've titled my intervention, Investing Against Erasure, Indigenous Knowledge Innovation as Decolonial Imperatives for Redressing Neocolonial Epistemicide and Securing Multipolar Futures. My intervention will comprise of 3 parts. First, and these are all brief sections, so don't become too worried about it, yeah? We'll consider some of the salient elements of our contemporary conjuncture. And the object of that is drawing our collective attention to the advent of multipolar world systems and the shifting dynamics that they entail. Second, we will examine some of our national challenges regarding progress towards reconstructing and developing our post-apartheid national system of innovation, paying particular attention to the incorporation of indigenous knowledge. In the third and concluding section, if all of us survive until then, we will raise a number of potential opportunities for expanding indigenous knowledge-based technological innovation. The overarching objective is to harness such innovation for transforming our socio-economic circumstances and contributing meaningfully to improve the quality of life of all of the people of our country, of our continent, and the wider world as well. So let's begin. Our contemporary conjuncture remains mired in a state of polycrises, as the long-standing hegemony within world system is increasingly being challenged by rival states. Through careful and deliberate investments in their respective productive capacities and capabilities, these rival states have developed their national systems of innovation, and actually many are achieving genuine technological sovereignty. As a consequence, they are now increasingly dominate the key scientometric data fields, and they do signal a significant realignment in the global distribution of knowledge and economic power. At the core of realizing the Africa that we all want, need, and demand is the urgent and active redressing of the systemic and structural epistemicide that originated in our colonial past of expropriation. This epistemic violence was subsequently reinforced during our insertion into imperialist global value chains of exploitation. And colleagues and comrades, it continues to be reproduced through the unequal exchange that characterize contemporary neocolonialism. Addressing this historical and ongoing injustice is therefore not merely a matter of redress, but a fundamental precondition for genuine transformation. As mentioned, our world systems are in a state of profound turmoil, lurching from one crisis to a succession of polycrises. This volatile behavior has far-reaching impacts and should not be regarded as unexpected, for they are the direct consequences of the prevailing inequitous global political economy, the deeply uneven international division of labor, and the existing balance of class forces. Before we turn to an analysis of our socioeconomic dynamics, it's imperative that we first note the deepening of our ecological precarities, which increasingly threaten the very foundations of human civilization. The United Nations Environmental Programme, in its recently published Global Environmental Outlook, predicts a permanent crossing of the 1.5 degree threshold in the early 2030s, heading towards 2 degrees by 2040 without immediate action from us. GEO7, that's the name of the report, further evidence support assessments that include the following 4 aspects. 1, the rate of global warming is likely to be higher than the central estimates that have been previously served to us. Second point, 1 million of an estimated 8 million species are threatened with extinction, some within the decades in front of us. The population of many species are in decline and their genetic diversity is being significantly eroded. Third point, between 20 and 40% of land was estimated to be degraded 4 years ago in 2022. Between 2015 and 2019, at least 100 million hectares. Colleagues, that's the size of Ethiopia. Yeah. That amount of fertile and productive land was degraded. And that's what's taking place annually worldwide. You know, as a consequence of this, we also have to take into account what goes in has to come out. And our annual solid waste now currently exceeds 2 billion tons. Given the current trends, it's projected to increase to 3.8 billion tons by 2050. This grim environmental forecast is indicative of the repeated failures of the preceding 30 Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is as we head towards the 31st iteration, which will take place this year in Antalya in Turkey. The data is also consistent with the assessment of the Stockholm Resilience Center, who argue that we have breached 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries, thereby endangering the capacity of the Earth, our home planet, to sustain those systems that underpin life as we know it. By crossing these planetary boundaries, we are increasing the risk of cascading non-linear effects across interconnected social, ecological, and economic systems. That is precisely what being in a state of polycrisis means. And this understanding affords us the opportunity to turn to some empirical details of our social and economic systems at play in our contemporary conjuncture. I'm going to pause a bit. That's a lot of data to have shared with you. Yeah? But colleagues, if you don't mind, with the organizer's permission, I'm going to be relentless in throwing more facts at us, and the hope that this informs your discussions in your breakaway sessions as well. So, a very important number. How many of us are there? Our current world population of human beings is estimated to be 8,296,000,000. Colleagues, that's as of this morning. Africa is home to approximately 1,584,000,000 people. That's just over 19.09% of the world population. Our population in South Africa is believed to be 65.45 million, and we represent a mere 0.79% of the total world population. According to the International Monetary Fund, the economies of world systems collectively produced approximately, now this, colleagues, you must bear with me, yeah? 2 quadrillion, 102 trillion, 895 billion rands. This time I managed to get it correct. You can imagine me tripping over that, right? That's our rand numbers. I come from KwaZulu-Natal as well. Put it a bit less troublesome. it's just 126.3 trillion US dollars. That's the global gross domestic product that we produced in 2025. Our regional contribution from sub-Saharan Africa was a mere 2.44 trillion. That's just 1.9% of the nominal economic output of the world. South Africa, which was considered to have made the largest single contribution to the continent's output, accounted for approximately 479 billion US dollars last year. That placed us ahead of Egypt and Nigeria in terms of ranking in 2025. But colleagues, our ranking cannot be taken for granted. South Africa's ranking with respect to its comparative status and economic output is not secure. The African Development Bank has just released its industrialization index and found that while South Africa's economy remained a continental powerhouse, its competitiveness has declined steadily. Now, colleagues, this is something that we must take to heart. Morocco has overtaken South Africa as the continent's leading industrial economy, driven by sustained industrial upgrading, export diversification, and strong industrial policy. This heralds the end of South Africa's 15-year dominance in the ranking of our continent's most industrialized economies. The FDB further iterated factors that have been consistently identified across our post- and neo-colonial history, which is that Africa's industrial integration is low, intra-African trade stands at just 14.4% of total trade, which reflects weak regional production linkages and fragmented industrial ecosystems. The FDB further notes that Africa accounts for less than 2% of global manufactured output and just 1.4% of manufactured exports. Our manufacturing value added per capita, this is as all of us Africans, has fallen below pre-2014 levels. That's where we are in 2026. Now, what happens with all that we produce? Well, we live in a world, as I mentioned, that's inequitous. There are some that own and some that work to stay alive. At a global level, wealth remains highly concentrated, with the top 10% owning 3/4 of global wealth, while the bottom half holds only 2%. Colleagues, keep that numbers in mind. I'm going to say it again. The top 10% of owners have 3/4 of the global wealth, while the bottom half, that's 50% of us, hold only 2%. In South Africa, the richest 10% hold 86% of total wealth, and the top 1% alone holds 55%. This, while the bottom 50% of our population has a negative net wealth at minus 2.5%. I hope that dawns upon you all. That's at the level of wealth. Incomes are disproportionately divided as the top 10% of our global population's income earners earn more than the remaining 90%, while the poorest half of the global population captures less than 10% of total global income. So all of you that believed that it was going to trickle down and eventually from your wages you'd be able to climb up the ranks, note, this is not, at least mathematically, possible, and maths is a science. This means that for roughly 30 million South Africans, average wealth is non-existent as debt outpaces assets. In South Africa, the top 10% of earners take 66% of total income, while the bottom 50% receive only 6%. All of this data, colleagues, comes out of the World Inequality Database, written by the famous, or headed by the famous Professor Piketty, based in Paris. The WID also noted that the income gap between the top 10% and the bottom 50% increased, moving from 103 to 118 in the 10 years between 2014 and 2024. What does that mean? We can do a quick check in terms of how we translate math into statistics, into math that reflects our realities. This means that the top 10% of income earners in South Africa make 118 times what the bottom 50% of the population earns on average. Yeah? Thus, the WID concludes that income and wealth are extremely concentrated in South Africa, with persistent disparities and limited change over time. Colleagues, there's little evidence of progressive change in the global distribution of incomes. The International Trade Union Confederation has recently reported that top CEO compensation in 2025 grew 20 times faster than the average worker's pay. So the CEO pay is rising 54% in real terms since 2019, yeah, to an average of $8.4 million US. That's the global averages for top CEOs. Whilst global worker pay, adjusted for inflation, declined by 12%. According to this data, the average worker would need to labor for 490 years to earn what a top CEO makes in a single year. The ITUC and Oxfam data also shows that CEO pay at top global corporations rose 11% in 2025, while average worker pay, this is those working in transnational corporations, rose 0.5%. Average CEO compensation reached, as I mentioned, 8.4 million, and which was up from what they earned in 2019, which was $5.5 million US on average. So global real wages for workers, as I mentioned, has declined by 12%. And giving you a sense of how sharp these inequalities are, the top 1% of households in the United States now controls 31.7% of their national wealth, which is the highest it's been since 1989. Yeah. This may also explain to you some of the behavior you see coming out of the White House. The Standard & Poor's, the S&P 500 CEOs saw median pay jump 25.6% over the year, and in 2025, nearly 1,000 billionaires earned $79 billion in dividends. Colleagues, I make this point with an emphasis. Why? Because who is it that's going to invest? Where is this wealth, and how do we link to it? Our socioeconomic determinations and our current ecological plight does not occur in a vacuum. Our Parliamentary Budget Office acknowledges that the obscene level of inequality in South Africa creates a very real limit on the economic performance of our country. The issue is not just that inequality is associated with lower social cohesion, as was mentioned earlier, more instability, conflict, but that huge, long-run disparities in the distribution of wealth and income, such as those in our country, affect the very structure and future potential of our economy. I hope this, again, is a fact that is settling with you, because it is a very unsettling fact. According to the Parliamentary Budget Office, those with more wealth and a large share of national incomes have options regarding where and how they choose to consume, save, and invest. they are usually more integrated in global communities and markets, and often consume and invest in a similar manner to those global elites. While most South African elites may appear fiercely patriotic, the data tells us they've been diversifying their investment portfolios to include more foreign assets as a way of offsetting our local risks. Again, colleagues, I'm saying this slowly and deliberately. The Parliamentary Budget Office therefore concludes that inequality has created a path dependence that for historical reasons has limited the level of industrial diversification and the development of productive service sector in South Africa. It has also created large obstacles to investment by non-elites into small and medium enterprises, and may be one of several reasons for the relatively small size of South Africa's informal sector. These are points that Dr. Kenny has raised earlier. Our ecological precarities, combined with the persistence of an inequitous global political economy, form the root causes of our levels of inequality and global stress. A key role in reproducing these unfair conditions is played by transnational corporations. And a recent study showed that multinational enterprises, which contribute to nearly half of the total global GDP, internalize the knowledge of planetary boundaries. In other words, they know about the ecological stress we are all confronted by, and take action within the organization or externally with investors, industry bodies, and policymakers. So, notwithstanding and despite warnings from ourselves as scientists, ourselves as knowledge holders, about us breaching planetary boundaries, multinationals at best follow an incremental approach to sustainability initiatives that collectively fail to drive positive global change. This well-entrenched practice remains unquestioned by external stakeholders such as regulators, investors, and lenders. Colleagues, as we continue to chase after these so-called investment pipelines, etc., do note what is it that we are offering up in return for the flow of cash to our country. In our contemporary conjuncture, the split between a global minority, or what we can call a golden billion, who mainly occupy the countries of the group of 7 highly industrialized economies, and is represented through their collective think tank, the OECD, and their military wing called NATO. They are being confronted by growing confidence and assertiveness of a world majority, which is still often referred to as the global South. The G7 economies accounted for approximately 44% of nominal global GDP, while the BRICS countries had reached 29% last year. However, utilizing purchasing power parity, and here, if you didn't know, purchasing power parity is the same GDP number, but now adjusted for living costs and local purchasing power, the BRICS are estimated to have captured 41% of global GDP, while the G7 share has been reduced to approximately 21%. Colleagues, that's not from a left-wing analysis. That comes from the IMF directly. Another critically important fact realized last year was that trade conducted by the BRICS countries without using the US dollar surpassed 1 trillion. In other words, increasingly, the countries of the global majority are even leaving this dying empire and not using its money between each other. These statistical nuances are indicative of the pathways ahead, as the BRICS, notwithstanding their inherent internal contradictions, have significantly advanced multipolarity and open prospects beyond the hegemony of the collective Wests in the interests of the world majority. From this potentially optimistic trajectory, let's turn to the progress achieved in our mobilization of indigenous knowledge for innovation. The previous Minister of Science and Technology, Mosibudi Mangenia Ntate, launched our country's indigenous knowledge system policy framework in 2004 and noted that the third post-apartheid government of South Africa had great expectations that the adoption of that policy would lead to substantial improvements in the lives of many citizens and their living conditions. Colleagues, that was 2004. The Deputy Minister at the time, Comrade Hanekom, acknowledged that it was an underlying fact that indigenous knowledge has always been and continues to be a primary factor in the survival and welfare of the majority of South Africans. Yeah. Derek argued further that the IKS policy would respond positively to a rapidly changing environment through which indigenous and local communities and individuals would share equitably in the social and economic opportunities. The then Director General, Rob Adams, specified 3 key deliverables, which he identified as: first, the recordal system for indigenous knowledge; second, the intellectual property system that reflects IKS; and third, an appropriate positioning of indigenous knowledge-based businesses within small business development. All of that was said in 2004. I'm sure, colleagues, I don't need to do the math in terms of where we are today. Yeah? It would take approximately 15 years before the IKS policy framework was translated into the legislation called the Protection, Promotion, Development and Management of the Indigenous Knowledge Act of 2019. The Act sought 5 key objectives, including to protect indigenous knowledge from unauthorized use and misuse, promotes public awareness and broader application of indigenous knowledge. Third, develop the capacity of indigenous communities to protect their intellectual and cultural assets. And fourth, to regulate the equitable distribution of financial and commercial benefits, while fifth and lastly, to encourage the use of indigenous knowledge to develop new culturally relevant products and services. That's from 2019. I hope you've seen the leap across the timeline. So notwithstanding the long incubation of the policy process, it's heartening to read of the institutional adoption of indigenous knowledges and their promotion across our national system of innovation. The current Director General of our Department of now Science, Technology and Innovation has recently argued that indigenous knowledge systems policy remains the cornerstone of government's approach to affirming African cultural values in the face of globalization, strengthening the contribution of indigenous knowledge to social and economic development in South Africa, and interfacing IKS with other knowledge systems. This positive sentiment also finds expression in sectoral strategies, such as that which we can find evidence of when the bioeconomy strategy recognized indigenous knowledge as underpinning it. In that strategy, it's noted, which is a national initiative to to promote bioinnovation and its use, and to use it for economic growth and social development in South Africa. That integration resulted in significant advances, and I think we see evidence behind us as well, in the subsectors of agriculture, healthcare, and the bio-based industry as a whole. Colleagues, at the National System of Innovation level, the SDI Decadal Plan cites the 2019 White Paper to argue in favor of a more inclusive perspective, which encapsulates a broader view of actors, forms of innovation, and the spatial footprint. It means supporting communities and civil society to innovate, embrace a more diverse knowledge system, including indigenous knowledge system, and addressing the decolonization of knowledge, and using innovation to improve service delivery, government decision-making, educational outcomes, and broadband access. So it does trouble me a little bit, MC, when you mention the issues that we are still confronted by today notwithstanding many people clapping their hands for our apparent technological revolutions. Yeah? It's still pay as you go for most. The SDI Decadal Plan recognizes that South Africa is endowed with unique mega biodiversity and rich indigenous knowledges related to medicinal plants. South Africa is well positioned to develop a sustainable and complementary IK-based health system. The Decadal Plan also acknowledges that research funding will be extended to disciplines of competence not covered in the National Research Foundation Act. Yeah? And the Decadal Plan also inserts a long-term intervention. Increase the value add of RDI expertise to the recording, protection, utilization of indigenous knowledge to the benefit of both knowledge holders and society. So besides listing performance indicators, such as the percentage of RDI expertise, research studies, and recommendations on indigenous knowledge systems that have been implemented, this Department of Science, Technology, and Innovation has also established an ambitious target of ensuring that 90% patents on indigenous knowledge are registered in the intellectual property database. Yeah. Besides these national opportunities, colleagues, the 39th Ordinary Session of the African Union adopted a number of draft annexes to the protocol of the agreement establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area. Included amongst those annexures, colleagues, is the annex on traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expressions, and genetic resources. Yeah. This is from the meeting of February 2026. This legal instrument of the African Union seeks to establish a unified continental standards that protect and commercialize African indigenous assets. Colleagues, it is imperative that we contribute to the finalization of that framework and utilize it to further incentivize investments in indigenous knowledge, indigenous research, the development thereof, the science, technology, and the enterprise that flows from it. Colleagues, I've said a lot. I can feel my throat is dry as well. Yeah? These are a lot of facts that we've been sharing with you. I sincerely hope these facts make you feel uncomfortable. If they make you feel comfortable, we need to be very worried about the society we are in and the ones we are creating. Yeah? So let me conclude about what I meant by investing against erasure. In summary, we have sought in this intervention to navigate the complex and interlocking dimensions of our contemporary conjuncture, with a specific focus on the imperative of integrating indigenous knowledge into South Africa's national system of innovation. The analysis began by situating our current moment within deepening states of polycrisis, characterized by the erosion of long-standing global hegemony, the rise of multipolarity, and the emergence of rival states achieving near technological sovereignty, as evidenced in the data. So Craig Stevens, in a recent article in the Canadian Veterinary Journal, warned that the word polycrisis was not created to serve as a catch-all to describe the growing number of existential threats all species face, such as climate change, habitat destruction, biodiversity loss, pandemics, changes in governance norms, growing pollution threats, the misinformation epidemic, the failures of multilateralism, and more. Rather, it calls attention to how individual crises that make up a polycrisis interact and affect each other, intensifying their individual impacts and giving rise to new collective threats. Attacking each crisis in isolation is no longer sufficient, because today's crises cannot be fully understood or addressed in isolation from one another. The intersecting crisis of ecological precarity, extreme inequality, and the ongoing reproduction of colonial epistemicides demands more than incremental or symbolic gestures. Colleagues, we must address the systemic erasure of indigenous knowledge systems and recognize that it is not a peripheral concern, but that it represents a fundamental precondition for genuine transformation. The multipolar shift in global political economy, while fraught with contradictions, opens strategic space for us as the global majority and for Africa in particular to assert alternative development pathways rooted in local knowledge, in our cultural assets, and in our innovation capabilities. The challenge, I want to suggest, with humility before the summit, therefore, is to move decisively from merely telling each other about the policy frameworks and the legislative instruments towards more tangible, community-centered, and equitably governed indigenous knowledge-based technological innovation. Only by doing so can we begin to redress the historical injustices, transform our socioeconomic circumstances, and meaningfully improve the quality of life of all people in South Africa, across our continent, and throughout our shared world. I thank you for your attention. I trust that the evidence presented here will sharpen your deliberations in your commissions and ultimately compel a decisive increase in the investments in indigenous knowledge innovation. Colleagues, as a non-negotiable decolonial imperative for redressing neo-colonial epistemies and securing a genuine multipolar future. Thank you very much.